come to
to the Beinecke one?
to the Beinecke
Okay.
one, yes. But no, you know what, let's just get started. We've got so much to talk about. Let's go ahead and get going. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to Voynich Day. We have our special guest, Professor Bowern is here, wave at everybody, wearing her Voynich swag. She's got her fabulous Voynich scarf on. I have my Voynich blouse on. It's Voynich Swag Day. We also have Curator Clemens here,
Hello.
who is the lucky man who gets to take care of the beast and all that comes with it. This is the cross you bear, right? You get to be the curator of the Beinecke 1600 collections, but
yes,
you also have to deal with this.
exactly.
So the plan for today is we've got, there are two here. That's mysterious. One of them is a manuscript, not a gift from aliens, but an actual medieval manuscript. The other one is a very high quality facsimile. So the first test is to figure out which one is which. I know, but I don't know if any of you can tell. Does anybody have a theory? Can you zoom in a little bit and let's sort of zoom in tight. So here is book number 1. And then over here is book number 2. And I don't know if you can tell just visually, just looking at them, which one is the actual Voynich manuscript and which one is this absolutely amazing facsimile produced by Siloé publishers of facsimiles in Spain. Anybody have any thoughts after taking a look at them? Just jump in, I can't really see you. If you have a thought, just unmute yourself. Should we take votes? Who thinks that this one right here is the real one? Anybody? I'll give you a hint. This one is the facsimile. This one that I am not touching with my actual hands is the real Voynich manuscript. And one way that we can tell this actually is because if you kind of zoom in here on the real one, you'll see we're looking at the end of one quire and the beginning of another. There's kind of a space there where the chords are visible on which it is sewn, whereas on this one, there is no such thing. So that's one giveaway. And the binding, this is a modern binding with modern ties as opposed to the actual binding over here, which is early modern limb vellum of some kind. And nicely, when they recently did some conservation work, they left the spine visible. So if I turn it this way, can you dive in there? So you can actually see the quire structure that way, which is very cool. Hi, Maya. Hi, Hannah. Good morning, everyone.
Hi.
So you can actually see the quire structure really clearly. And that turns out to be very significant, the quire structure of the manuscript, and we will learn why as we go through our day. So I have, hold on, I see things in the chat. Okay. Yeah, so I think other people are probably going to use the wrong one too. If you're posting in the chat, I might not see it. So if you have something that you want to comment on, just jump right in. All right, so you'll see in addition to the screen on which you can see me and the books, there's also my shared screen. So that's where we're going to be going through the slides, but we'll also look at particular parts of the actual manuscript. And then there are parts of the actual manuscript that are really fragile, in particular these foldouts. And so for that, we'll be using the facsimile. All right, here we go. So the Voynich manuscript, this crazy, mysterious manuscript written in this crazy, mysterious language, code, glyph set. We don't even know what to call it because we don't know whether it's a code or a transcription or a translation or gibberish. We just don't know. This is where people like Professor Bowern come in. It's her job to figure that out. My job is to think about the codicological structure of the manuscript, what we can learn from that, and the paleography, which is of course why we're here, because we are going to learn some Voynich paleography. And as I said last week, I'd never taught Voynich paleography before, so this is the first time ever in all of history that this particular topic has been taught. So that's exciting news. So here we go. So you've all read, presumably, Ray's, the pieces that I assigned to you from this fabulous book with its fabulous author right here. I highly recommend this book, The Voynich Manuscript, edited by Ray Clemens. It's very inexpensive and it's really, really terrific. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in here, and it comes with a facsimile, a photo facsimile. And as you've seen, the whole manuscript has been imaged, very high resolution, open access images available online. Not good enough for some Voynichologists who think that they need to be higher resolution. These images are high enough resolution for anything anybody wants to do. So let's run through the history of the manuscript really quickly, because everything about this manuscript, anything you can glean is going to be important. And anyone who has a theory to put out there about the Voynich manuscript, is extremely important that all of the things that we know about it already are factored into that theory. I've kind of become a professional Voynich debunker over the years. And part of my response is always, have you done the reading? Have you checked the facts? Make sure that whatever you're doing is consistent with what we actually know about this manuscript. Because there are a lot of people out there with a lot of ideas about it, and many of them are not founded on anything except their own inspiration. Is that the right word?
But they still get published. The Times,
yes, anyone will publish anything these days.
Was it 2 years ago, the Times Book Review in London published a whole article about how the Voynich was just abbreviations that one could use capellis to decode. And they told me this was coming out, and I said, do you want to run it by me just to see? Because I've seen a few. No, we want everyone. It's absolutely convincing. We want it all, everyone to see it all at the same time. And I got it, and I was hysterical. I thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen.
It was embarrassing.
It was embarrassing.
Yeah. Right. So let's talk about the facts. So here's what we know, what we think we know. The first time the manuscript enters the historic record is when it is purchased by Emperor Rudolph II of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, sometime in the late 16th century. We don't know exactly when. But the reason we know this is because of this letter. This is the facsimile of the letter. The real letter is in the stack somewhere. But we have this letter that was written in 1665 that details the early history of the manuscript. And it came to the Beinecke with the manuscript itself, and it provides a lot of information. We have to take it on faith that what is reported here is true, because there isn't any secondary evidence yet supporting some of the earliest history of the manuscript. So Emperor Rudolph II buys the manuscript. He passes it on after his death. He thinks it's written by John Dee. It isn't. It's maybe it was owned by him once upon a time. Probably not, but there's no evidence. Right. There's no evidence. People really, really want John Dee to be associated with this manuscript, but the evidence is very, very circumstantial. After the emperor dies, he leaves the manuscript to Jacob Tinapius, whose name in Czech I cannot pronounce, Tepnech. And if we go to the actual manuscript here for a moment, we go back to the very first page. There is, in fact, an erased inscription right here. Can you zoom in on that? You can see this part at the bottom that has sort of a stain and that is damaged. And under ultraviolet light, you can actually read this. So there's the first page. Here we're going to zoom in at the bottom and look at the ultraviolet image. Kind of hard to see in this light, but you can in fact make out this signature of Tinapius, who was an alchemist in Prague. So far we've got 2 owners in Prague. We're in Prague where Rudolph's court was, and now Tanapius, who inherits the manuscript. He passes it on to his friend Georg Baresch in the middle of the 17th century, or when he dies. So he dies in 1622. So at that point, it's handed over to Georg Baresch. Then it makes its way to Johannes Marcus Marci, and he was the one who wrote this letter that he sent with the manuscript when he gave it as a gift to Athanasius Kircher, who's a very well-known Jesuit scholar. And so this is a letter to Kircher from Marci. And in this letter, he explains what he knows of the history of the manuscript and then talks about efforts to decipher it. Kircher had just published a dictionary of hieroglyphics. So Marci was convinced that nobody but Athanasius Kircher could possibly figure out what this manuscript says. So at that point, in 1665, the manuscript is sent to Rome. And it stays there for a really long time in the hands of the Jesuits, we think, probably. So at the Collegio Romano, the librarian Petrus Bex, his book plate is in one of these boxes, associates it, continuing the association with the Jesuits in Rome. And then the Jesuit college at Villa Mondragone outside of Rome, which is where Wilfrid Voynich finds it and purchases it. The story, what really happened, we don't know, but the story goes that he was there, they needed some money, they said to him, buy whatever you want, just go rummage. And he found this manuscript and he just kind of added it to his pile. And so he's got this big pile of manuscripts and he says, well, I'll give you this much for this group. And they're like, sure, fine. So he takes these manuscripts. They didn't really know what he had bought or what he had left. So he has this manuscript now. During his lifetime, he refused to say where he had acquired it. Possibly because he wasn't, maybe he didn't feel that he didn't want them to know that he had ended up with it, or to enhance the mystery of it. So all of these rumors start flying around Voynich that maybe he had written it himself, or who knows where it had come from. So about 1919, Voynich comes to the United States and sets up shop in Manhattan, right across the street from the New York Public Library, and starts trying to market this manuscript. And the only way he knows, the only way anybody's going to buy this book is if he can get some scholarly credibility behind it. Somebody who can read it, who can give it a really fantastic origin story, and then he's going to sell it for $100,000, make just buckets and buckets of money. Nobody wants to buy this manuscript because nobody knows what it is. In the meantime, just after he moves to New York, he is bragging to someone at a dinner party in Chicago about this manuscript he owns that no one can read. And the person sitting across from him does his patriotic duty and reports it to the FBI and says, there's this immigrant with this funny accent, he's probably Jewish, and he has this manuscript that's a code. So I think you should investigate him. And they do. The FBI investigates Voynich for years, accusing him of having a secret code book that he's using to spy on the United States government. Eventually, he convinces them that it is, in fact, an ancient manuscript. And he does this with the help of several professors, one from the University of Chicago and one from the University of Pennsylvania. This gentleman, Professor Newbold. So William Newbold is the first person to put out a Voynich theory and then be publicly humiliated about it. It's a long line of people who have had that experience. His humiliation happened after he was dead. So it didn't happen, they waited to publish the rebuttal of his theory until he had died. And so his theory is that the manuscript is written in basically micrography, that each glyph or letter form is made up of tiny little letters that when you put them together, they create an encoded text that he then decodes. It's not true. It's just not. And his theory results in he draws this conclusion that the whole thing was written by Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon, 13th century Roger Bacon. So this idea that Bacon had a telescope. So this is supposed to be a drawing of one of the nebulas, the Andromeda Nebula, I think. And the world goes crazy when this is announced in 1919. And then his book is published posthumously. And there are all these articles in the newspaper. It sounds familiar, right? This is what happens today. Somebody puts a theory out there to the world, the press goes berserk. And then later on, in a respectable journal, Speculum, the Journal of the Medieval Academy of America, the organization that I am now the executive directress of, which is a nice synergy. In Speculum, after his death, his theory is just savaged, just completely ripped to shreds in 50 pages. Probably the longest book review that's ever been published in Speculum. So moving along, Newbold's theory has been completely trashed. No one will buy the stupid manuscript. Voynich dies in 1931, and the manuscript becomes part of his estate, where it is recorded in the 1938 de Ricci census of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts in the United States and Canada. It's recorded as just the cipher manuscript. So now his wife has it, Ethel. So Ethel has the manuscript now. She can't sell it either. And the office manager, business manager, Ann Mill, continues to try and network and try and work her contacts to see if she can sell this manuscript. They're going broke with Voynich after Voynich died. They don't have money to pay off their debts. They can't sell anything. The depression is hit. The great collectors are not buying for the time being because they can't, they've all been demolished by the depression. So they're stuck with it. They put it in a safe and they just leave it, even as they're selling off all of their stock, shutting down the business, but they still have the Voynich manuscript sitting in a safe, and they're paying to insure it, but they cannot get rid of the damn thing. Then Ethel dies in 1961. The manuscript is inherited by Ann Mill, their longtime business manager. So now Ann Mill's trying to sell the manuscript by herself. She can't do it. She makes an arrangement with a book dealer, Hans Kraus, in New York. She sells the manuscript to him for $24,500 in exchange for a commitment that when he sells it, she'll get half of the proceeds above her original sales price. So now Hans Kraus has got the manuscript. It's 1962. And for 7 years, he's trying to sell this manuscript. No one will buy it because nobody knows what it is. Is it a forgery? Is it a fake? Was it something Voynich did? Nobody knows what it is, what it means, how important or unimportant it might be. And so Kraus is stuck with it. And yet at the same time, there are all these people who want to see it. Everyone is showing up. People make demands. They want to look at it. They want to order pictures. And so in the end, he decides he's going to give it to an institution so that it can be freely studied. And that institution, as spoiler alert, as you can probably guess, was the Beinecke Manuscript Library, with whom he had a really long and fruitful business relationship. Yale has hundreds of manuscripts that they bought from Kraus over the years. So it has been here. Here it is. And it has been here since 1969, just sitting in the dark in its cozy little custom box, waiting for someone to figure out what the heck it is. And now that there are high resolution images online, the whole world can get after it. And I'll tell you really quickly, my own relationship with this manuscript started in 1988 when I was hired as the assistant to the curator of pre-1600 rare books and manuscripts, Robert Babcock, here in the Beinecke when I started grad school. And Bob, for whom this was really a cross to bear, this manuscript, he wanted nothing to do with the correspondence. And so part of my responsibilities involved handling Voynich-related correspondence. So whenever some theory showed up or someone needed images or they needed something checked, it was my job to go and answer that. And so I had correspondence going with some interesting people for a while there. So I've been really interested in this manuscript for a really long time. But it's only in recent years as it's become more well known online and more solutions are getting posted and tweeted and blogged about and just out there on social media, that I started doing more and more reading about it. This book came out, that I've read several times. And I saw in several places people saying things like, we just don't really know how many scribes there are. We really need a paleographer to look at this problem. And at one point I thought, holy crap, I'm a paleographer. This is the job I was born to do. And so that's how I started thinking about the scripted scribes of the Voynich and actually thinking of it as a legitimate object worthy of actual study instead of just something that you roll your eyes about. And of course that still happens, but it is an actual real medieval object and worthy of study. Now, before I give the big reveal, and if you did the reading, you already know the answer to this question. There's a little blank space at the top of my slide there for the date of origin of the manuscript, of the parchment for the manuscript. And if you did the reading, you know this already, but I would ask you, paleographers that you are, if I just showed you this image and I said, well, what do you think? You're paleographers. What do you think? What does it remind you of? What era does it feel like? Is it late antique? Is it pre-Caroline? Is it Caroline? Is it Romanesque? Is it Gothic? Is it humanistic? Pick one. Don't be scared. Any thoughts? Come on, don't be frightened. Anyone have any ideas? Here, let's look at it this way. Here are some Voynich letters on the left with some analogous letters from a contemporary manuscript. Can you zoom in? Can you make that bigger? I don't know if it's possible to make that larger for everyone. Yeah, that's much better. Does that help? Any ideas? Anyone?
Humanist?
Who said that? I can't see. Who said it? Yes, exactly. It is very, very reminiscent of Italian humanist manuscripts. That doesn't mean it's Italian. People like to think that that means it's Italian, but it does not mean that at all. And yes, it has a lot of similarities to some of the characters. So the characters that I've put up, the Voynich characters, some letters on the left, some numbers on the right, are very similar to what you might encounter in an early 15th century Italian manuscript. This one is from the Huntington, and here I put them side by side. Now, the trap that people fall into is they think, oh, well, that looks like a humanistic letter. That looks like it's Italian. That's really similar to what you find in Italy. Therefore, the manuscript must be from Italy. And that's the kind of leaps of logic that we really have to be careful about, because we don't know where this manuscript was written. Those similarities could just be coincidences. Could be written by someone, in Timbuktu for all we know. We just don't know. All we know is that it enters the historic record in Prague. That's really all we know. There is other evidence in the manuscript, though, about its earlier history, and we'll look at that in a minute. However, they did in 2011, something like that, the carbon dating,
Yeah, I can find it.
Oh, it's in the book, yes.
It is in the book.
It is in the book.
Sorry.
So carbon dating of the parchment concluded within a 98% probability or something very solid. 2009, that the parchment was sourced, the animal was killed and stopped growing between 1404 and 1438. That's a really great time period. That's a pretty short window there. So, and people like to say, well, maybe the parchment sat around for 500 years. Maybe, but that's pretty unlikely. Maybe Voynich cleaned the parchment. He found old parchment, cleaned it all off, and forged this new manuscript. Possible? Really unlikely. You know, you got to think about the bell curve, right? I mean, in the realm of possibility, yes, it could have been dropped off by aliens last week. Sure.
But Voynich would have had to have known what the inks.
Yes, exactly.
And he was writing in a time before the forensic analysis of inks. So
right, and testing on the inks has also shown that they are consistent with medieval ink. That they are not, they don't have any modern, and the same with the pigments, that the inks and the pigments are all consistent with medieval techniques and medieval ingredients. So I think we all feel pretty good saying, yes, this manuscript dates from the early 15th century. Where? I don't know. Almost certainly not on this side of the Atlantic. Some have argued that it's Mesoamerican. Pretty unlikely. We now know Roger Bacon is definitely out because he was long dead. People wanted to make a case for Leonardo da Vinci. Nope, he wasn't even born yet. So then you get people running around going, well, if it's from the early 15th century, who are the people we know about who might have made this manuscript? Well, that's very nice, but of all the people who were alive at that time, how many of them have actually made it into the historic record? Pretty small few, pretty small number. So now we're left with, so that's all we know. That's all we know. There's a lot still we don't know. For example, what the damn thing says. And so now I want to give you a very quick tour of the contents, and then to show you the sort of thinking about the genre of this book. So it begins with 55 leaves, and I'm going to leave this just sitting here open, but I don't want to handle it any more than absolutely necessary, so I'm going to flip through this book, because this one we can do whatever we want to. So we start with pages and pages and pages of botanical illustrations. I've heard this one referred to as representing cannabis. So we go, and each of these appears to be, when you compare it to other botanicals, other herbals, this is how they tend to be written, where you have a very detailed illustration. So for each one of these plants, it has got some kind of flower, it's got a stem and leaves, and it has a root system. And then you have some kind of text that presumably describes it, how to take care of it, and what its features are medicinally, or what it's used for. And this goes on and on and on for 55 leaves. Then, and they're really not particularly identifiable as real plants. People spend a lot of time trying to identify these, but some of them are pretty clearly not real plants. But maybe they're fantastic, badly drawn illustrations of real plants. I couldn't possibly tell you, but there are people who have devoted an awful lot of time to identifying what all of these different plants are. So when we get through that section, we have sort of some miscellaneous stuff that we'll talk about more pretty soon. Then you have the first of a series of foldouts. Now the actual foldouts in the manuscript are much too fragile to open. So for the foldouts, we have to look at the facsimile. But these are, they're stars, sun, moon. There's some kind of astronomical or astrological, and you can imagine how excited people get about these stars, because each one of them seems to have a label next to it. And if, of course, if we could read what these labels said, we would know something very useful about the manuscript, but we cannot read them as of yet. Then you have these zodiacal diagrams over here. Some of them are missing, but there should be one per month. They're very clearly identifiable as signs of the zodiac. So this one, for example, you've got the two fish. So here's Pisces, here's Aries, and on and on. And this is where we get some of the evidence about the mysterious 150 years between when the manuscript was produced and when it arrives in Prague to Emperor Rudolph's court. Because in the middle of these diagrams are these later annotations. Can you see that right there? I'll hold it up this way, right there. So that one says April, for example, but they're not obviously recognizable as any particular Romance language, but they are definitely some kind of Romance language where the names of the months have actually been recorded in a slightly later hand than the manuscript. I don't think it's too much later. What do you think?
I would agree with you.
Yeah,
Seems
so
15th century.
yeah, I think we're all in agreement there that those were probably added in sometime in the 15th century, but are they evidence about the early ownership or the early journeys of the manuscript? Probably. Then we get to my favorite part of the manuscript. I love this part, the balneological section. So balneology, there we go. Balneology is the medieval science of medicinal bathing. So it's called the balneology section. We don't know if that's really what it's about, but it has all these pictures of ladies bathing and some kind of waterworks flowing. So, and then over here you have what seem to be, and I always say seem to be because we just don't know, but they sure look like biological diagrams. And down here too, that looks like a female reproductive system. Is it that? I don't know. I wouldn't say it is that, but that's what it looks like. All right, so then you've got the balneology section, and that goes on for a while. Then we have what is this pretty fabulous fold out, and we cannot, definitely not open it in the real one because it is extremely fragile. But you start with these three pages, and then you open it, and you get this really crazy page in 9 segments. It tends to be referred to as the Rosettes page, and these are identified by directional quadrants. So this would be northeast, this is northwest, south, and so on, just as a way of identifying where you are on the page. And they have writing, and they have little, there are little structural images. This looks like a little castle here. What this is, I have no idea, but it's another part of the manuscript that people who study it really get obsessed with. Is it a map? Is it some kind of diagram? Is it some kind of chart showing movements of people across space and time? I can't even, who knows? It's so, there's nothing like it. There's absolutely nothing, nothing analogous to that. And then you have kind of some miscellaneous bits back here that seem to be out of order, maybe, that are kind of mixed up. These pages that are referred to as pharmacological, because they've got all of these what look like ingredients and then some kind of vessel and maybe some instructions. Are they recipes? Maybe, maybe not, but that's sort of what they look like. So they tend to be referred to as recipes or the pharmacological section. Some more botany, a few more herbal pages mixed in, and then we go back to the pharmaceuticals. And then at the very end, you have a whole choir here of paragraphs, each of which is marked by a star. There are not 365 of them. We'd like there to be 365, but there are not. And of course, what is this? There's absolutely no context for this. There isn't even any illustrative context to help you get a handle on what this might be. The other sections of the manuscript, at least you could kind of posit a guess based on the illustration. And then the manuscript ends there. And then, can I flip this to the back? All right, so let's look at the last page of the actual manuscript so you can see what we're talking about here. So way up here at the top, can you zoom in at the top there? There are a few lines of text that are kind of a mixture of German and Voynichese and maybe something else. They're not the same as the script and the text that you find elsewhere in the manuscript. And these few lines, very difficult to read, faded, abraded. A lot of people have thought are the key to the whole thing. Maybe, maybe not. That's the crux of this whole manuscript. It's always maybe, maybe not. So that's the object itself. So now let's talk. I'm going to move into talking about the methodologies that Voynichologists use to attack this manuscript. The first thing you have to do when you're, I'm just going to open it onto someplace where it lies comfortably. There we go. One of the things that you have to do when you're looking and you want to do some kind of a linguistic analysis, say, you can't type this into a word processor or some kind of computing because a computer can't parse these glyphs. It can't make any sense out of them. So a long time ago, 40 something years ago, Voynichologists started creating transcription alphabets that allow you to type in Voynichese using ASCII characters. So here's an example of one of those. This is called the European Voynich alphabet, or actually now it's known as the extensible Voynich alphabet, and it's the one that most people use. So if you are going to substitute one of the characters with one of these ASCII characters, the main thing you always have to remember is it doesn't mean that that is what that character means. This is totally random, not completely random because some of them sort of look like what they're transcribed as, but there's no semantic relationship between these substitutions and the Voynich glyphs. They just allow you to type up to transcribe the manuscript in a way that then a computer can go in and start analyzing different combinations and different frequencies of letter forms, which then linguists like Dr. Bowern can then compare to known languages and see if there are any patterns that emerge. Now, there are other transcription alphabets. Here's one called V101 that identifies many more glyphs, many more symbols in the manuscript. So then you have to ask yourself, well, how many letters are there in Voynichese? Nobody can come to agreement on that question. Everyone has their own ideas about what constitutes a separate two different letters. Two letters that look really similar but are different, slightly different in the way the stroke turns to the right as opposed to going straight up. Are those the same, just written slightly different, or are they actually two different letters? It may sound like kind of an obscure and unimportant detail, but it's really, really important for linguists to make these decisions. And they have to base their work on this, at the very beginning, on understanding how many letters there are in Voynichese. I have my own ideas based on my paleographical analyses, because I come at this as a paleographer. So this is my collection of Voynichese symbols in order of frequency. The one where people really disagree the most is this one that looks like a 4 and a 0. I'm going to refer to it as QO because in the transcription alphabet, that the letter that looks like a 4 is called Q. So this is transcribed as QO. I would make the case that because every time this character occurs, which is a lot, all these yellow highlights are places on those pages where you get that. It is always, almost always, not always, go back, but almost always, everywhere in the manuscript, whichever scribe, those two characters are ligated. So they're always connected. The number of times that you see a Q without an O, just off by itself, are so rare as to be almost statistically insignificant. And so I would make the case that that's actually a separate letter, that it's not a Q followed by an O, but its own separate glyph. And this becomes significant when you start looking at letter frequency. So, for example, these are all of the glyphs that have a occurrence of more than 2% in the Voynich manuscript. And you can see in this calculation, this is assuming that Q and O are two separate letters. So when you look at this, if you calculate it that way, O is the most common letter. Remember, it's not an actual O. I'm just talking European Voynich alphabet here. I'm speaking EVA. So the O is the most common, and you can see the Q down there circled has a percentage rate of almost 3%, whereas the O is almost 12%. If we redo the calculation and assume that QO is a single character, so we have to subtract from the number of O's, the number of QOs, so it's not double counted. Look at what happens to the O. Suddenly the O is in third, and its frequency rate drops to less than 9%. And the QO is basically exactly the same because there are so few instances of Q by itself. For me and my work, this feels significant to me. For linguists, it's even more significant, as Claire would tell you, because the frequencies really matter when you're trying to compare with frequencies in other languages. Claire, do you want to jump in? Do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, not a lot to add to it, but no, I agree absolutely. And so I guess one of the things that I would add is that when we're decoding letters or trying to work out how letters are formed into words and things like that, often we make use of our knowledge of the language to do that. So, for instance, if we have a Latin manuscript and we're reading what's on the page, we're usually not reading the individual letters. We're getting a sense of the word and say, okay, so that word must be incipit. Therefore, even though I can't really read this P, I know it must be a P because I know what this word is. And so for Voynichese, we don't know what the words are. We don't know what all the letters are, and so that makes it very difficult to build hypotheses about what the language underlying it and what the relationship is between the words and the words, the letters, and the sounds that the letters might represent, even if they even do represent individual sounds.
Right, idea, right? We don't even know what genre the separate letters represent.
Right. Yeah. So for instance, if it's a kind of substitution cipher where we write, say the C character, the most frequent character in the graph that's on the screen right now, if that's an E, and then say the next one is an A, and then the next one is an I, or something like that, we could kind of read it like that, but of course we get gibberish from that. And any sort of decoding like that has produced a lot of the examples of decoding and decipherment tend to be based on these sort of pretty straightforward substitution ciphers, and they all produce gibberish because they don't produce reasonable language that underlies the system. Therefore, we're probably not dealing with that sort of system, but what other sort of system we're dealing with is very much up in the air.
And that's why there are so many linguists working on this manuscript and trying to attack it from all sorts of different angles. And no one has really found the answer yet. We still not even know for sure whether it represents an actual human language or whether it doesn't. You know, there are people who argue it does and people who argue it doesn't. And they've all got strong, mathematical and linguistic arguments. And we just
well, actually, so, Lisa, sorry to interrupt, but I would say a lot of these theories are not not so much from linguists, but they're from people with hunches. So they have my brilliant idea is that, you know, I looked at this manuscript and I thought, oh, I bet it's this, and then I look at all the ideas that make me think, all the evidence in favor of it being this. I think it's Estonian, and so I'm going to pour all my energy into that.
You always have to go back to first principles with any theory, right? You have to go back to the very beginning and see what they're basing, what are the assumptions that they're starting with, and if those assumptions can't be argued in a way that is valid and convincing, then the whole thing just falls apart.
Right, and the assumptions are usually based on hunches and their own brilliance, and that often falls apart, as we have seen, sometimes in private, sometimes in the pages of the Times Literary Supplement. My
dog spoke to me or something.
Right.
All right, so let's move on now, and let's talk about the glyph set, right? So we've already identified all of these that have kind of analogs that look familiar, that are designed to lead you astray because they look so damn familiar. But then you've also got these that are called Gallows characters that are can be classified according to how many loops and how many legs they have. So they're very, very common. They're found everywhere in this manuscript. And they're unprecedented. They're just totally unusual. Then you've also got what are called bench gallows, where that bench character is stretched out, interfixed with a gallows to create this new character. And those also can be classified by the number of loops and the number of legs. So there already you've got a series of characters that need to be added to our glyph set. Then on this sort of just shows where you can see all of these characters in their natural environment, and that's actually page 50. It's folio 56 and 57. Let's see. I need to go backwards. Where is it? Here we go. So these two, just by a nice coincidence, on these two facing pages, 57B and 58, you can actually see just about every character that's used multiple times in the manuscript. And where Tobias is zooming in right now is actually a really interesting page that has a lot of characters that appear only once. So I've circled them here that are just totally mysterious with absolutely no idea, and they don't appear anywhere else in the manuscript. Now there are pages that are missing, and we'll talk about the codicology in just a minute. And then you also have these, which are some of my favorite Voynich characters they look sort of like they're ligatures of benches and bench gallows. But they also tend to appear only in the top margin, or between paragraphs, which suggests that they're decorative, not that they don't have a special semantic purpose. But that's also still to be determined. But I'm really fascinated by them because they look like an attempt to combine these different gallows in some way. And if we just knew what the gallows meant, we would be able to parse what's happening in these kind of combos, in these ligated combination gallows and bench gallows characters. All right, so now let's talk about paleography, because that's why we're here. Let me keep an eye on the time. If everyone can stand it, I think we won't take a break because we just have so much to do. If you need to run off and take a break, please do, but I'm gonna forge ahead because we just have so much we want to talk about. So let's talk paleography. So what we're looking at here is folio 31V and folio 32. So I'm going to turn to those leaves in the actual manuscript. Here we go, 31 verso and 32 recto. And I will add here you can zoom in to the folio number. This foliation was added later. This is significantly later, maybe 17th century, maybe.
It seems early to me, but I don't go past 16th century.
Okay, 16th, 17th century, after the manuscript was rebound. And since that foliation was added, about a dozen leaves have gone missing. And we know that because the foliation skips. So that's how we know how many leaves are missing. We don't know how many leaves were missing before the foliation was added. So we have no idea how many leaves were actually originally in the manuscript. But if we zoom in on these two, did I just do that? There we go. Just by looking, can you just sort of zoom in to the middle, like just zoom in as tight as you can? Yeah, there we go. So does anybody want to make some observations about these two hands? Is this one hand? Is it two hands? How are they the same? How are they different? Anybody want to jump in? Do you have any observations to make?
They look fairly different in terms of just even the size and sort of the I guess would be kind of the ductus would be related to the cramped sense of the one handwriting.
Yes, exactly. So this one over here on the left is much more tight, cramped, slanted, whereas the one on the right is the lines are more broadly spaced. This one, I hate to use that word, but it's more legible than the one on the right. And so this back in the 70s, these two hands were distinguished by a Voynichologist named Prescott Currier. So he was the first person to identify these two hands, known as scribe 1 and scribe 2. He also observed that there are linguistic patterns that are unique to scribe 1 and that are unique to scribe 2. So even though they're both writing in Voynichese, they have different linguistic quirks. I won't say linguistic, that's the wrong word. Orthographic, who knows what they mean, but they use Voynichese slightly differently. And those differences also are really important and is something that's being investigated much more now by linguists and computer scientists. And those differences are, they're called language A and language B. Language A is scribe 1, language B is scribe 2. Claire can also pitch in here, but I don't think they're different enough to be called different languages. That just feels weird to me. I'm not a linguist, but I wouldn't use that term. I tend to say dialect just because they're different, but they're not super different. I don't know. Claire, what do you do?
Yeah, I use language in scare quotes, I guess, yeah, for exactly the same reasons that you mentioned. So we don't know whether it's the same language underlying both systems, but a different encipherment system, or whether it's a whether there's different variations in more like regional dialects or more like two closely related languages, or if one is Latin and one is French, depending on the encipherment system, you might get similar sort of things. But they do come out as different in tests for things like word frequency. And there are some patterns which are extremely common in one, which are not very common in the other. But overall, they're pretty similar. So the characters that are the most frequent in each language are pretty similar. They differ a little, but then we have much more of we have more samples of language B than of language A.
Because language A is only scribe 1.
Right. Yeah.
So you talk about hand A, hand 1, scribe 1, scribe 2, and language in quotes, language 1, language A, and language B. So those are two different two different things, right? The writing system versus what is being written. Those are two different things, but there is a very close association between language and scribe in the manuscript, and that feels significant. We just don't know what it actually means. So we've known for a long time scribe 1, scribe 2. Prescott-Currier went through the rest of the manuscript and made a stab at making other scribal distinctions, but his work wasn't really thorough, it wasn't really done, and it wasn't all that convincing once you got past scribe one and scribe two. And so this is why I decided to get in, to start doing paleographical work on this manuscript, because, as I said, I am in fact a paleographer and a Voynich, and someone who's interested in the Voynich. So it's a nice intersection of interests of mine and skill sets. So now let's talk about paleography. So we've talked about this a lot. Paleography means a lot of different skill sets, right? It's about a lot of things. So it's about attribution. So comparing your manuscript with manuscripts of a known date and place to see if you can decide, is it French, is it Italian, is it early 15th, is it late 15th? And that's the kind of work that we've done, right? When we were looking at uncials. Well, this is Italian uncial, this is Northumbrian uncial, how do we tell the difference? This is Northern Gothic, this is Southern Rotunda, how do we tell the difference? And so that's attribution. With the Voynich, there are no other samples to compare to. So attribution is out the door, we can't do it. What else have we got? Literacy, well, obviously, literacy is no good, right? We're trying to learn how to read Roman cursive. You all were champions at that. We're learning how to read Batard, right? We're learning how to read these scripts that are not familiar to us. We can't read Voynichese, so we can't do that either. So attribution is out, literacy is out. What have we got left? Well, description. Let's dig into the individual hands. Let's look at the graphic properties. Let's talk about ductus. Let's talk about how each individual letter form is formed, and talk about how we can determine when a page was written by one scribe as opposed to having been written by another scribe. And we did that as well, right? Remember when you were looking at the Caroline manuscript, 571, I think it was, where we looked at all the different hands that occurred and tried to think about how we can distinguish between them. By looking at the abbreviations or particular letter forms. And so we're going to take that skill set and apply it to the Voynich manuscript. So that's what we did. That's what I did. And as you know, you've read the article, hopefully, that I assigned you, where I talked about this application that I used called Digipal, or now it's known as Archetype. I custom designed my own database on my computer at home, called it Voynich Pal, and it allows you to go through, select and annotate individual features, apply your own custom data, metadata to them. Then you can pull those annotations out and you can sort them and you can throw them in a light box where you can start moving them around like you had, as if you had paper on your desk and you're shuffling them and sorting them into categories. And so that's how I started this process. I looked at every different glyph, every different form, letter form, and zeroed in on forms that, by comparing scribe 1 and scribe 2, which we already knew were different, which were the letter forms that seemed to be really different from scribe 1 to scribe 2, but consistent within that hand. So the way that in Austria, I might look at a CT ligature and use that to determine a hand, identify hand, or an ampersand, or some other abbreviation, or a question mark, or a gatitis, looking at these different features that are generally the same, but have individual ticks that you can zero in on for identifying one hand or another. So here, for example, there I am sorting and moving things around on the page and dividing them into groups. And so here, for example, are 4 versions of the letter form, 1 loop, 2 legs, the Gallows that in EVA is known as K. So here's a K. So if I were to put these in front of you, my paleography proteges, what are the features of these forms that look different to you from one to the other? What are the kinds of what makes them individual? in terms of the way that they're written? What are some of the features that jump out at you as different from one to the other?
They have different feet.
Yes, exactly. Yes. They use the very last tick at the bottom of the right-hand ascender. The little foot there is different from one to the other. Anyone else?
The bottom curve on the loop is a little bit different in angle with each one of them.
Yep, that's exactly right. So if you're looking at that loop, the bottom right, sort of where it intersects the ascender, right? Is that what you're talking about? There's a different angle there. That's right. Yes. So we've got a loop. We've got feet to look at. What other features? There's one other feature that struck me as interesting.
The crossbar is angled differently.
Yep, exactly. And the reason it's angled differently is because of how the scribe is moving their pen. So for example, on the far left, it's a sharp right angle from the ascender to the crossbar. And that's because the scribe has lifted their pen, gone down, and then made the crossbar. Whereas on the third one, it's curved. And that's because the scribe didn't lift the pen. They go up and then down and across to make the curve. So by looking at the way the pen moves, the way that the scribe has formed the letters, you could start to make these distinctions. So there we have the feet, the angle of the ascender, what's happening, whether it's made with one stroke or two, so whether the pen has been lifted before that crossbar happens. And then finally, what's happening, that tells you something about whether that crossbar is going to be bowed or if it's going to be horizontal. So if it's horizontal, that implies that the pen has been lifted, whereas if it's bowed, then it's the stroke comes from the top of the ascender and curves into the loop. So after doing all of that work, I ended up with 5 scribes. And the other glyph that I used to make this distinction that was actually even more determinative than the K is this up here that I've circled, just this last bit of the letter form that in EDA is transcribed as an N, this last bit. So if you look at what happens with this bow, it's quite different. This finial is quite different from one scribe to another. So in scribe 1, it has this very long, open, broad bow. Scribe 2, it's much tighter. Scribe 3, it almost closes completely, right there. Scribe 4, there's a sharp angle right here, like a 45-degree angle, and then it comes up. And then on scribe 5, it's just this long, flat finial that hardly bows up at all, but it extends quite far to the left. And that's really, really consistent from hand to hand. So whenever you see that finial on the end, that's scribe 5. Whenever you see this finial on the end, that's scribe 2. That is actually sufficient to distinguish between these hands. And then, of course, you have to add in all of the other features to confirm what you've determined. But in my work, it seems that that one letter form is sufficient to define what's happening in all the different hands. Now, where things really get weird, and now we're getting weird, is when you start to look at how the hands are, how the different scribal corpora manifest themselves in the manuscript. This is where it's just wacko. See, everybody's nodding because it is, it's wacko. So here's how this works. So I'm gonna go quire by quire. And fortunately, the manuscript does have quire, there we go, it has signatures. Added a little bit later after one of the rebindings, but it does have signatures. So that's, of course, super helpful for determining the codicological structure of the manuscript. And this wonderful facsimile over here actually reproduces the bifoliate quire structure of the manuscript with the sewing. And in fact, if you could take it apart, you would see that these are conjoint. this page is conjoined with this leaf is conjoined with that leaf, and so on. So you can then start to map out how different hands appear protocologically throughout the manuscript, and it's weird. I'll show you. So we're going to start with the botanical section, choirs 1 through 8. So this is using an application called VisCall that allows you to visualize the bifolia of a manuscript as if it were taken apart and you had scattered it on the table in front of you, which of course we're not going to do. But if you could do that, this is what it would look like. So what we're looking at here is choir 1, 4 bifolia. We've talked about bifoliate choir structure. So we've got 4 bifolia. This is the first one right here. Leaf 1 conjoint with leaf 8. So what we're looking at here is leaf 1 and leaf 8. So 1 recto is conjoint with 8 verso, and 1 verso is conjoint with 8 recto. So that's what these diagrams show you. So the first few choirs are entirely scribe 1. There's choir 1, here's choir 2, here's choir 3. Now when we get to choir 3, this is when everything gets wacko. So in choir 3, we see scribe 2 for the first time. And scribe 2 writes the entire second bifolium, the whole bifolium, the front and the back, all 4 pages, both leaves of the bifolium that's in the middle of this choir. Now that's crazy. That is just so not the way that medieval manuscripts work. You just don't see that. And I've actually got here a mock-up that shows how this works. So for this exact choir, so starting at folio 25, here's the central bifolium. So in this diagram, that's the one at the bottom. So that's this one down here at the bottom. So this is the central bifolium. Both sides of this bifolium are written by scribe 1. Here's the next bifolium, all of it written by scribe 1. Then we get to the third bifolium. That's this one, the one outlined in red. All of this is written by scribe 2. Then we go back to scribe 1. All of this written by scribe 1. Stack them up, fold them through the middle, and there's your choir. Now, in a regular medieval manuscript, you would not see scribes mixed this way. You might see them mixed, but they wouldn't be mixed by bifolia. It just doesn't make sense for the way that medieval manuscripts are produced. The implication is that the leaves are out of order, that somewhere in the history of the manuscript, the bifolia got mixed up and it was rebound early on in the wrong order. And the reason we know the rebinding happened really early, here's a perfect example. If you zoom in right here, so here is, this is scribe 1. Over here is scribe 2. Over here, right here is an offset of this flower. So these have been they've been stuck looking at each other when the book is closed. The surfaces have been touching for a really, really long time. And so this early rebinding happened a very, very long time ago, before the folio numbers were added. So now we're starting to put together a kind of a codicological history of the book. So it was, at some point it was rebound, at some point the bifolia were misordered, and then the foliation was added, and then some leaves were lost. So that tells you something already about the history of the object. There's also this really catastrophic water stain in the upper margins of the first 40 or 50 leaves that predates the addition of the folio numbers. So the folio numbers happened after the water stain. So maybe the water stain was the reason the book was rebound in the first place. And then it was rebound out of order, and then the foliation was added, and then the leaves get lost. We don't know. But there's evidence, codicological evidence, that helps you to piece together all of these events, all this trauma in the history of the manuscript. All right, so Then we continue to see this mixing of scribe 1 and scribe 2 for the next few choirs until we get to choir 4 when scribe 5 makes an appearance for the first time. Scribe 5 does only the outer bifolium. So here again, we have another example of the scribes doing entire bifolia and the bifolia being mixed in this really bizarre and unprecedented way, at least as far as I know. All right, here's 7 is scribe 1 and 2. Then we get to 8. We're missing a bunch of bifolia here. So we have the outermost bifolium, and then the next one, and then because the foliation has been skipped, you can tell that there are in fact 3 bifolia that are missing, or 6 leaves. And in this case, we've got scribe 5 has written 1 side of the bifolium and 1 page of the other side, and then scribe 1 does 57V, which is that wacko page where this one, where all of those unique letter forms were. That's scribe 1. And then scribe 3 does the other bifolium that this is mixed with. So here we've got 3 scribes mixed up in unusual ways. All right, then we get to this section, the astronomical, astrological section, entirely written by a new scribe, scribe 4, writes all of this, and that includes the, wait, where am I? All right, okay, then the Beinecke section, which is a very large choir of 8 bifolia, and 5 bifolia, so 10 leaves, entirely written by scribe 2, the whole thing. Then we get to the big fold out, where if we jump ahead here, after the Beinecke section, here we go. So here's the fold out. The fold out, this side of it is entirely written by scribe 4. The other side, so here you can see 3 pages of the other side, plus this page, and these 2. It's kind of hard to visualize unless you can see it unfolded like it is there. So the other side is entirely scribe 2. So here we have one very large sheet in which scribe 2 and scribe 4 collaborated, where scribe 2 did one side, scribe 4 did the other side. Then we have these kind of random fold-outs that don't seem to belong together, that are probably out of order, nested by botanicals and the recipes, all by scribe 1. Then we have some more botanicals, 1 bifolium by scribe 2, nested with a fold-out by scribe 3. And then several fold-outs, 2 nested fold-outs of recipes by scribe 1. And then we get to the very last section, those starred paragraphs, where we have mostly scribe 3 at work. This was a mega choir. At this point, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It was originally 7 nested bifolia. That's a lot. And the entire thing is written by scribe 3, except when we get to folio 115. And so I'm going to ask you, Tobias, to zoom in here. Let's look at folio 115 or so. 14, 15, 115 verso. Okay, so here, if you look really carefully, you can see something happens after the first 11 or so lines when we get to what looks like a new paragraph. Hold it, this is the facsimile, so I can do this. So you've got all of this, and then a change. So we have a change of scribe from right here to there. And this is one of those moments where you're going back and forth, and you could convince yourself that every line is by a different scribe. But I'm pretty convinced that what we're looking at here is scribe 2 on the first 12 to 15 or so lines, and then we return to scribe 3. And you can see that there. That's what I'm talking about in the slides. So here we have another example of where scribe 2 collaborates with another scribe on the same folio. So that, I think, may tell us something about scribe 2. don't know what, but something. Scribe 2 is a collaborator throughout the manuscript. So that's it. Those are our scribes. That's how they make their way through the manuscript, and how the codicological structure is just so strange that it can only suggest that some kind of intervention has happened, that somewhere in its history, the manuscript was bound out of order. There's a lot of interest in looking at these offsets, like the one I just showed you on wherever it was, 34, 30, 31. These places where the one side, we weren't going to see it there. Oh, here we are, where the pigment from one page has been offset in a mirror image on the other. So if you could find, for example, an offset here that matched a leaf 15 leaves before, that would be really solid evidence of the original sequence of leaves of the manuscript. So far, unfortunately, that has not come to fruition, but it's something that I continue to work on to see if I can find any places where there are offsets that don't match what is actually across from them now, and find other place in the manuscript. My suspicion is that originally entire choirs were by scribe 1, entire choirs by scribe 2, perhaps an entire choir by scribe 3. That's my suspicion. It seems sensible, but how that actually plays out, I couldn't tell you. But it does have some significance for people who are trying to solve the manuscript. If they don't know what order the leaves go in, you can't expect it to make expect it to make sense if you don't know what what sequence the leaves originally went in. Now, the last thing I want to do is show you how these linguistic determinations between language A and language B. There are some places where it's really easy to tell the difference. Can you make my slideshow bigger? Because that's what we're going to look at now. There we go. So here we have a bench gallows. So the gallows with 2 loops and 2 legs interfixed in the stretched bench. And that is very rare in dialect B, but quite common in dialect A, in scribe 1, or language A. So that's one distinctive characteristic between dialect A and dialect B. And then here's another one. This one is really dramatic. The what in EVA is DY, looks like 8-9. At the end of a word is so common in language B, dialect B, it's so common as to almost be unimaginable statistically. It's really dramatic how often you see that ending in dialect B, and it's incredibly rare in dialect A. And in a minute, Claire, I'm going to toss it over to you to talk about that, but let me just get through this last one. And then finally, this question of the QO. Very, very common throughout the manuscript in both language A and language B, except in the pages written by scribe 4, where it's very, very rare. So that's another kind of subcategory that would be interesting to investigate about why. Is it because of the content of those pages? That might have something to do with it. Or is it because of the version of Voynich that scribe 4 uses? That combination, that QO glyph, is just not needed as frequently. I think that's the last one. Yes, okay. So Claire, I'm going to toss it over to you if you want to chat a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. So I guess with scribe 4 and the QO to start with, there's been a suggestion that most of what scribe 4 is writing are labels so we have the some of the astrological diagrams and the zodiacal diagrams, and so if those are basically labels might have either a different case or they might not have articles depending depending on the language, things like that. And so that might lead to a different structure for those pages. And so there are things that lead to differences in the sorts of statistics we're looking at just because of the genre or because of the subject matter, and not because of the underlying dialect or anything like that. And that's one of the issues with using some of these methods for studying the Voynich manuscript, because all of these things, when we use them on Wikipedia text, or we use them on Wall Street Journal corpora or things like that, we kind of know what's underlying it, and so we can abstract away from the things that might lead to really problematic differences, whereas we can't do any of that for the Voynich manuscript. Another thing that I wanted to mention was, so with Lisa's scribal identification, I teach a class on the Voynich manuscript every couple of years, and the students do final projects on things that interest them. And last year, a group of students who were majoring in computer science and statistics and data science did a topic modeling analysis of the Voynich manuscript. So they took the transcribed data, and we looked at page level and paragraph level and so on, and used document summation techniques to figure out what are the main groups of pages. And we did this without putting any information in. So we know something about the groups of pages from the illustrations, either because we don't have illustrations, or because we have botanical illustrations or balneological illustrations, etc. So we found that topics alone. So we got our topics through computational measures, which I'm happy to talk about, but it's a little involved. So so just assume computational measures for now, but I'm very happy to explain in more detail. But basically, it's picking out the most distinctive vocabulary in each set of pages. So these methods are used, for instance, to make summaries of medical records, or of articles, or of reviews on Amazon, or things like that. So we were using these techniques for the Voynich manuscript, and using these term frequency keywords for different sections. We came up with 5 or 6 sections, but the pages that were grouped together didn't exactly match the pages from the balneological section or the pages from the botanical section, etc. It was only when we started looking at Lisa's scribal identification and looking at the combination of subject matter as identified by the illustrations and the hands together that we were able to make sense of these groupings. And then in that case, they made a lot of sense. So for instance, scribe 4, who's doing mostly labels, doing mostly illustrations and diagrams and so on, always stood out as being basically a topic on their own, or a group on their own. But with the herbal sections, the only splitting off scribe 3s from scribe 1s and so on was also divided up the topics for the analysis. And so that I thought was a really nice independent validation, both of the hand material and of the fact that we were identifying some sort of either subject matter or coding principles or something like that were picking out differences amongst the different pages.
And that's so helpful for me, because my work, I may still refine this, right? I mean, I've published it, but I'm publishing something else about it, and I'll probably publish about this again, and this work is refinable, right? And so looking at I'm so grateful to Claire and their students for sort of digging into my own results and putting them to the test. That's really what I want. I want there to be confirmation or rejection, right? I want to know if any of these attributions make no sense at all. If they're totally contrary to the linguistic analysis, then I'm going to go back and refine them, because paleography is a lot about judgment. It's about the human eye. It's not really a science in that way, in that it's really subjective in a lot of ways. So I'm always happy to be put to the test and have the opportunity to refine my work. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to say. I want to open it up, throw it out to you guys. If you have questions.